The air over New Orleans in the earliest years of the 20th century carried a perfume of magnolia blossoms, river mud, and Creole spices. On hot afternoons, sunlight poured down like honey onto the narrow streets of a neighborhood called Back O-Town, where wooden shotgun houses stood shoulder to shoulder under the sprawling oaks. The cobblestones were uneven and warm, and the sound of distant laughter mixed with the low hum of insects. It was here, in a poor section of the city, that a child named Louis Armstrong drew his first breath on August 4, 1901. No one on that drowsy summer day could imagine that this small boy with bright eyes would one day change the sound of music across the entire world. The neighborhood itself was a patchwork of ordinary struggles and extraordinary soul. From early morning, the clatter of milk carts and the calls of street vendors echoed down Dauphine Street. Yet beneath the noise of daily survival, something softer simmered. Music was always in the air. Louis spent much of his earliest childhood in the care of his grandmother, a woman who held the family together with quiet strength and deep faith. Her small house felt safe, filled with the aroma of simmering beans and the flicker of a kerosene lamp at dusk. When the boy did live with his mother, Mayanne, he learned to navigate the lively and sometimes hard-edged streets with a quick grin and an open heart. The sidewalks became his playground, where he watched coal wagons roll by and chased after ice trucks in the stifling summer heat. There were nights when he lay on a thin mattress and listened through the open window to the sound of a distant cornet. The notes came floating across the rooftops like fireflies, soft and golden. Those sounds planted a seed in the boy that would grow deeper with every passing year. Poverty could not take away the melody that lived inside him. It only made the music more necessary, more like air. New Orleans in those days was a city where music did not simply exist, it breathed with the same rhythm as the people. Brass bands were a constant presence, leading slow funeral marches to the cemetery and then erupting into joyful, bouncing rhythms on the way back. Louis would follow these parades, his bare feet slapping the pavement, his whole body moving to the swell of trumpets and trombones. The second-line dancers twirled their parasols under a sky turning peach and lavender at twilight. Even the Mississippi River seemed to hum a bluesy tune as paddle-wheel steamers drifted past the levees. Young Louis discovered that he could earn a few pennies by singing on street corners with a quartet of other boys, their voices blending in sweet, ragged harmony. The coins they collected meant bread for supper, but the feeling of making music together was its own reward. It was a kind of prayer that rose up with the heat of the day. As Louis grew, he did odd jobs to help his mother. He delivered coal, sold newspapers, and hauled buckets on a junk wagon through dusty morning light. The work was hard, but it taught him to observe the world carefully, the way light shifted through the leaves of a magnolia tree, the way tired people could still smile when they heard a good tune. On Saturday nights, the saloons and honky-tonks of Storyville lit up with crimson lamps, and the low rumble of piano music seeped out into the street. Louis would sometimes peek through the swinging doors to catch glimpses of older musicians lost in their craft. The sound of a cornet cutting through the smoke-filled room was like a lighthouse beam in fog. He could not yet afford a real instrument, but he would hum into an imaginary horn, feeling the notes in his chest. The city itself became his first music teacher, showing him that every moment, sad or joyful, could be turned into song. One fateful New Year's Eve, Louis fired a pistol into the air in celebration, a common practice that was also illegal. The loud crack echoed through the neighborhood, and before long, a policeman was leading the 12-year-old off to the colored waif's home for boys. This moment could have been a dark turn, but instead it became the quiet door that opened his life. The home sat on a stretch of land near City Park, surrounded by old live oaks draped in Spanish moss that swayed gently in the Gulf breeze. Inside its grounds, there was a strict routine, but also a sense of order and care that Louis had rarely known. The director and a music teacher named Peter Davis noticed the boys' hunger for music. When Davis placed a battered old cornet in Louis's hands, the world seemed to pause and listen. At the waif's home, Louis entered a world of morning drills, school lessons, and brass band rehearsals under a gentle sun. Peter Davis taught him the notes and the proper way to purse his lips. The first sounds that came out of that dented horn were shaky and uncertain, like a baby bird testing its wings. But day after day, the boy practiced in the dappled shade of the yard, the Spanish moss hanging still as velvet curtains. The band performed at neighborhood parades, and Louis was eventually made the leader of the home's brass band. Wearing a clean uniform and holding his cornet with growing confidence, he felt something he had never fully felt before, a sense of purpose. The strict but nurturing environment transformed the raw street kid into a budding musician. When he was released a few years later, the home had given him not punishment, but a gift no one could take away. Back in the streets of New Orleans, Louis was no longer just a boy singing for pennies. He was now a cornet player with a sound that was beginning to turn heads in the warm, gaslit dance halls. The older musicians of the city recognized his talent, none more so than Joe King Oliver, a skilled cornetist who took Louis under his wing. The nights grew long and sweet as Louis played his first professional jobs, standing on small wooden stages with peeling paint while couples slow-dragged across the floor. The air smelled of rose water and tobacco, and a single electric bulb might sway gently overhead. He learned how to listen deeply to the players around him, how to weave his notes into the fabric of a song like golden thread. In those early hours, as the last strains of a cornet faded into the Louisiana night, the young man would walk home under a canopy of stars, his instrument case swinging at his side. He was still a boy in many ways, but the music inside him had grown into a quiet, steady flame that would light the road ahead. The city of New Orleans never slept in silence, but in its quieter hours a young musician could hear every nuance of sound. After his release from the waif's home, Louis Armstrong moved through the neighborhoods of his youth with a new kind of alertness. He hauled coal and sold produce during the day, but when evening came he would wander toward the honky-tonks and dance halls that lined the edge of Storyville. These were simple places, brick buildings with shuttered windows and doors that stood open to let the night air in. Inside, the walls were soft with age, and the low ceilings held the smoke of 100 cigars. On tiny stages lit by kerosene fixtures, men in worn suits played blues and ragtime until early morning. The young cornetist watched and learned, his dark eyes catching every finger placement and every breath control trick. The city was a living school of music, and Louis was its most devoted student. It was during these formative years that Louis fell under the gentle but powerful wing of Joe King Oliver, the man he would later call Papa Joe. Oliver was not just a gifted cornet player. He was a master of tone and a quiet leader who carried himself with a dignity that inspired everyone around him. Their relationship grew on the bandstands of the River City, but also in the soft, everyday moments, sharing a plate of red beans and rice at a Creole kitchen table, or sitting on the levee at sunset and talking about notes as if they were old friends. Oliver taught Louis to use mutes to change the color of a sound, to make his cornet growl or cry or laugh. They would practice together while the Mississippi rolled by, that great old river that seemed to hold all the sorrow and joy of the South. In the fading light, the older man would place his hand on Louis's shoulder, a silent gesture that said, "You are ready for something bigger." The seed of a dream to go north to Chicago, to take the music to a wider world, began to sprout. By day, Louis still worked blue-collar jobs to keep himself fed. He delivered coal to the grand homes of the Garden District, where magnolia trees cast deep shade over wrought iron fences. He learned to see beauty in the smallest things, the way morning light caught the dust rising from a shovel of coal, the rhythm of the wheels of his delivery cart on the brick streets. Even these ordinary labors fed his music, giving him a deep sense of timing and a respect for the working people who would later become his most loyal audience. After work, he would clean up, put on the best shirt he owned, and head to a back-alley honky-tonk to play for dancers who moved with a slow, loping grace. In those smoke-filled rooms, the cornet was not an instrument for show, it was a voice that told stories. Louis learned to make his horn sing about heartache and hope in the same breath, and by the time he was 18, his reputation had spread from the French Quarter to the far end of Canal Street. The city of New Orleans in the summer of 1922 was a sultry dream of heat and sound. Louis received a letter from King Oliver inviting him to come to Chicago and join the Creole jazz band. The news arrived like a cool breeze. He packed a single suitcase, kissed his mother and grandmother goodbye, and boarded the Illinois Central train at the old wooden station. As the locomotive pulled away from the platform, he pressed his face to the window and watched the familiar shotgun houses and live oaks slowly give way to open fields. The journey carried him north across the green, rolling countryside of America, through small towns where people waved at the passing train and the fields stretched out under a wide, friendly sky. He had never traveled so far from home, and the rattle of the wheels on the tracks became a kind of lullaby. In his lap, the Cornet case held everything he believed in. The night settled over the train like a velvet blanket, and Louis slept peacefully, dreaming of a city by a great lake. Chicago in the early 1920s rose out of the flatlands like a city made of hope and steel. When Louis stepped off the train at the Illinois Central Station, the air was cooler and the sky seemed wider. But what struck him most was the rhythm of the place, the streetcars clanging along Michigan Avenue, the boats on Lake Michigan, the hum of a city where thousands of Southern families had come seeking a new life. Lincoln Gardens, the dance hall on the south side where King Oliver's band held court, became his new home. The hall had a high, arched ceiling and soft amber lights that made everyone look like they were painted in gold. On opening night, Louis stood beside his hero, trembling slightly, their cornets pointed toward the dance floor. When they began to play together, the two horns locked into a perfect harmony that made the room hush for a moment before erupting into cheers. It was the beginning of a legendary partnership, and the start of a revolution in jazz that would be recorded for the very first time. The first recordings of King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band took place in Richmond, Indiana, in a quiet studio far from the noise of Chicago. Louis had never seen a recording horn before, that large, cone-shaped device that captured sound waves and etched them into wax. The room was small and felt almost sacred, with walls draped in heavy fabric to deaden the echo. The musicians had to stand perfectly still, careful not to bump the equipment. When the engineer signaled, a hush fell over the room and the band began to play into the morning light that streamed through the windows. Louis was so moved that he later said he cried when he first heard his own notes played back on a record. Those early discs, with titles like Chimes Blues and Dippermouth Blues, captured a sound that was raw and warm, like the inside of a sunlit wooden church. In the grooves of that spinning shellac, jazz began its journey from local dance halls to living rooms all across America. And at the center of the sound, bright and clear, was the cornet of a young man who had once sung for pennies on the streets of New Orleans. As his confidence grew, Louis began to step out of the shadow of his mentor. He met a talented pianist named Lil Hardin, a woman with a gentle smile and a sharp musical mind. Lil came from Memphis and had studied music formally. She saw in Louis a genius that needed encouragement to stand on its own. They would sit together at an upright piano in a sunlit apartment, working out harmonies while the afternoon light fell across the ivory keys. Their friendship blossomed into a romance that was tender and supportive. Lil urged Louis to leave Oliver's band and form his own group, to become the frontman he was meant to be. It was a difficult decision, like a young bird being nudged from the nest. But in 1924, with Lil by his side, Louis moved to New York to join the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. The skylines changed, the rhythms of the city became more electric, but through it all, the soft heart of a New Orleans boy remained at the core of his sound. Even as his fame began to rise, Louis never lost his connection to the simpler things. He would walk the streets of Harlem, watching children play stickball in the golden evening, listening to the gospel choirs that poured out of storefront churches on Sunday mornings. On quiet afternoons, he and Lil would take the train out to the edge of the city and walk through green parks where the noise of traffic faded. They talked about the future, about the music they would make together. At night, Louis sometimes sat by a window with his cornet, not playing, just holding it, feeling the cool brass warm under his hands. The moonlight would trace a thin silver line along the bell of the horn. It was in these still, tiny moments that he felt most grateful for: the grandmother who raised him, for the teacher who believed in him, for the city that had given him its soulful rhythm. He was still the boy who listened to the river, only now his river was the whole wide world.